Bespoke radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Good evening. Fade to Black. Bespoke radio for the masses. Yeah. How you doing? How you doing? Today's Tuesday, September 17th, 2019. 261 days into the new year, just 104 days left. We are live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California. And I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world, all across the United States. Hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, the planets. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? Good evening. Tonight, very special guest, first-time guest Adam Apollo is here. It's going to be a great show tonight. I met Adam at Contact in the Desert for the first time, and watching his presentation and the way that he presents himself, you're going to be blown away tonight. Adam Apollo, as a child, he had several encounters with extraterrestrial starships. Since awakening at 15 years, Adam dedicated himself to extensive studies in theoretical physics, symbolic geometry, past life recall, Sanskaric healing, Taoist alchemy, martial arts, energy therapies, occult magic, and many ancient and modern spiritual traditions and practices. He has had countless contact experiences. He organized C-SETI and E-SETI events and called and connected with hundreds of starship crews and developed a comprehensive knowledge of many species who have interacted with humanity over many millennia. He is the founder of the Unify movement and a lead systems architect for several international online academies. He has also provided development, consultation, and white paper editing for multiple organizations focusing on sovereignty, decentralization, cryptocurrencies, and is also working on an infrastructure to support the independent sovereign web, a distributed cryptographic social system, and future Starship dashboard called the Core Network. I would like to welcome for the first time to Fade to Black, Adam Apollo. Adam, good evening. How are you, man?
Doing great, Jimmy. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, it's great to hear your voice. And before we get started, let's get one thing out of the way, which is the first-time guest disclaimer. All right, now the next time you're on the show, you're not going to get it, but you get it now, which is this. It's just you and I, Adam, sitting on my couch having a conversation as friends, and where that conversation starts, it starts. Where it ends, but we're going to end as friends. There you go. You ready to go?
Sounds good to me, Jimmy. Let's do it.
Let's start with the basics. Where'd you grow up?
Well, my parents divorced when I was 2 years old. So even though I was born in Oakland, California, they traveled a lot until I was around 2. And then my dad ended up in Austin, Texas. He's a musician. My mom ended up in a little tiny town called Red River, New Mexico, way up at 9,000 feet in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico. And so I was between them a lot as a kid. Basically traveled back and forth, every few months until I started school. And then I was with my mom in school primarily because this tiny little school with like 30 kids, K through 5, was just way better for my education than the Austin City schools, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. I tried Austin City schools around second grade. It was a total shit show, except for art class, which was amazing. I started learning how to draw in 3D, which was the best part.
Right.
But my dad also lived in Philadelphia for a time and St. Louis for a time after that, and eventually moved to the North Shore of Oahu in Hawaii. My mom, around the same time, ended up moving to North Carolina. And so I've spent a lot of time in the mountains of Western North Carolina and also in Hawaii during my middle school and teenage years.
That's pretty cool. I mean, you get a little taste of everything. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you this, though. New Mexico, for all of us, right? High strangeness, capital of the world. Yeah. Did anything crazy go down at that age?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was really little, I think about 6. I remember being in first grade and kind of trying to process my experience after it happened at school the next day and trying to figure out if it was a dream or not. But my mom at the time was living at this ranch, and she led horse tours, and I had a little donkey named Chiquita, and we'd do these horse rides way up into the mountains. And one evening I went outside, and sometimes the night sky up there at 9,000 feet in New Mexico is just so crisp and clear and dry. I used to joke that you'd have to look for the dark places between the stars. And I was walking around this little lake that was just in the ranch and kind of cruising around and looking at the stars and just having a moment to myself outside. And all of a sudden, this light comes down the valley, and it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. And then it comes right over me and over the lake. And I remember it getting so bright that it was like blindingly light. And I was like, what is that? And then all of a sudden it just blinks, shoots off, and flies over the mountain. And I was like, it was quiet. There was no sound. There was no nothing, just this light. I went back to the house. I was like, Mom, I saw this light. It was huge in the sky. She's like, whoa, really? I was like, yeah, it was like amazing. I don't know what it was. She's like, that sounds really interesting. Like, strange, and I remember being at school and telling people about it, and they're like, sure, okay, cool, some big thing in the sky, that's weird. And nobody really treated it as seriously as I felt it. So I started wondering, like, was this a dream? And I actually went to my mom, a couple weeks later, and I was like, Mom, do you remember me going outside, and did I come back in and tell you I saw something bright in the sky? She's like, yeah, you saw something. And that was it. And that was the only time I really saw something unquestionably powerful in the sky when I was living in New Mexico, even though I saw shooting stars all the time. Right. And just all the time, just everywhere in the sky. Anytime I look at the sky, boom, there's one, and I didn't think anything interesting about that until I started realizing that sometimes shooting stars don't go straight. Sometimes they turn 90 degrees half the way, but I had to learn how to pay attention to that as I grew older.
Now, when your awakening was at the age of 15 years, a very critical age for any teenager, but between your first sighting in New Mexico and the age of 15, was there contact? Was there things that were going on through that period? 7-8 years.
The only other major experience I had that came with an object in the sky that I couldn't explain happened with my dad and a couple of my stepbrothers when he was living just outside St. Louis in a little town called Robbinsville. And there's sort of a shortcut from the highway. You could take this dirt road and take a shortcut over to where we lived in this little valley, train tracks and a river. And we were taking this dirt road shortcut. And at some point, I'm in the back seat. My dad's in the front seat. My stepbrother's in the passenger seat. And he looks up out through the dashboard window and he says, "Stop the car, stop the car, stop the car." And my dad like hits the brakes, stops the car. We jump out of the car. He's like, "Get out, get out." And we get out. We're like, "What's going on?" My heartbeat's racing. I'm like, "What's happening?" And he's like, look. We look at the sky and there's these 3 lights and they're in a triangle shape and they're just weaving back and forth across the sky. And we're all just like, whoa. And then all of a sudden, they like speed up. It spins a little faster, goes down over by the horizon, and then shoots across the sky like a shooting star.
Gone.
And gone. And we were all just looking at each other like, did that just happen? Like, did we just see that? And we're all
that's an epiphany.
in.
That's an epiphany right there.
Yeah. And that's one of those moments where, and I'm, let's like 9 or 10 at the time, where you're just like, how, like, what is that? Like, come on, like there's no aircraft that does that. And by this age, I was already just extremely logical and investigative in all of my thinking. I was real smart in school. I generally aced everything. I had above 4.0 grade average. I, won trophies for being the top grade point average from K through 5th grade. And I had problems with a lot of the answers that I got in school. And at that point in time, I started really wondering and questioning certain things about the way that we describe our history, the way we describe our reality. I had significant issues with questions like, what is heat? And then the teacher like actually can't answer the question for me, like what heat is. Oh, it's vibrating molecules. I was like, well, what are the vibrating molecules? Oh, well, they're protons and electrons and neutrons. And okay, well, what is that made of? And then they're like,
Right.
I would run into dead ends with teachers all the time. And I was like, there's some real problems with our thinking. And there's a lot of gaps that I'm finding throughout school. And that only grew, especially as I got into middle school. I started feeling more and more that I had this kind of sinking feeling like my teachers were lying to me about stuff. And I'd hear some story about something that happened in history or, hear the way that something was described in science. And I'd just be like, that does not ring true for me. Like there's a problem here. And it was the feeling of that problem and the real sense of like depression and anxiety and feeling like I'm being lied to, and that there's something odd and wrong about this whole story of reality that I'm in that eventually led to this experience, which you call my awakening.
Teachers don't, and scientists, right? They don't like it when they can't answer a question, or when they know that they
tough.
have, or when they have to stick to dogma that they don't believe, and suddenly you guys are in an adversarial position. Last night, and I know about your interest in theoretical physics, and we're going to talk about some of that in just a bit. Last night, I was listening to an old interview with Richard Feynman. And here we have one of the great, theoretical physicists of our generation, and somebody that is so respected. But this interviewer says to Feynman, he goes, okay, when you got 2 magnets and you're trying to push them together and there's a force there, and there's a force, and it's repelling, what is that? Feynman got pissed.
Oh yeah.
He's like, why would you ask, why do you even want to know the answer to that question? And he danced for 10 minutes and never went back and answered the question because he doesn't know.
Because nobody knows the answer to that question. Although when we get into theoretical physics, I'm going to speak about some things that will actually explain the answer to that question much more fully and richly than Feynman did. Even though I believe, Feynman is absolutely brilliant, made a lot of great breakthroughs. But physics itself has been missing huge chunks of reality. And part of that is, a result of the way that we have studied reality and the way we've constrained our capacity for understanding through developing specific models like the scientific method, et cetera. And we try to remove the subjective observer as much as possible. But of course, you can't remove the subjective observer when everybody is a subjective observer, and we're all just cross-referencing with our own subjectivity. So there's innate problems to logic and the scientific method itself. And then these problems, of course, become part of physics as science tries to break away from religion. And, there's a whole long story we could get into around that if you want to go.
Yeah, and we can go there. And the reason why, for certainly with me, and I think a lot of people out there that have the time to invest into research into the UFO question and what is going on out there and seeking answers, you will eventually align yourself with physics, theoretical physics, the quantum mechanical side of things. And that part of science, the theoretical physicists out there, and that are into astronomy and the cosmology side of things, down to the quantum level, understand that the numbers and the math and the equations clearly state a lot of fantastical things that point in the direction of the planets and intelligent life, and we're not alone, and in the theories of multiverses, and that research will take you, and they are right there with us, and we are getting close because of the research that is going down to prove these things that have been unprovable in the past, and we are right there. That's theoretical physics, and getting into that is a very important part of our community here. And it's starting to blend, don't you think? They're starting to overlap.
Absolutely. Well, because we're starting to uncover a deeper underlying truth. We've realized we've had a lot of theories and a lot of beliefs, but we're starting to see a deeper underlying truth. And once you begin to get the underlying framework, everything starts to make sense. I mean, when we zoom back into my life story and we look at me as a little kid going into high school, I got fascinated with the Drake equation, which for most of your listeners probably are aware of it, but it's basically an equation to estimate what the likelihood is of there being other intelligent life out in the universe. Now, at the time when I did the Drake equation, there's a couple parts that you plug in. One of them is, what is the percentage of stars around that have planets that have the capacity to support life. Now, at the time that I was in high school, the number of planets with the capacity to support life, or the stars, the percentage of stars that would have those planets, was extremely low. Like
zero. It was like zero.
The number of stars that have planets is going to be maybe 1%. And we thought that the number of stars that have planets that also have planets in the Goldilocks zone is, 0.000 something percent. And when you plug in those numbers to the Drake equation, you still get the potential of thousands of, literally millions of planets with life, and thousands of planets, that could have intelligent life when you're looking at the scale of the entire universe. Now, nowadays, when you look at the Drake equation and you now apply current numbers, we now know that literally 99% of stars have planetary systems. Correct. And we believe that over half of those stars with planetary systems have planets that have the capacity to support life, which means that over half the stars in just the 200 billion stars in our galaxy alone could have planets with the capacity to support life. That's 100 billion planets potentially with life out there just in our galaxy. And, you add the piece of the equation where, in a pinhead point on the sky, we see thousands and thousands of galaxies, and the universe starts to look like a pretty busy place, actually, well populated with many kinds of intelligences. And that's just looking at it from the most basic scientific baseline perspective.
Back when we did the panel, when you were on the panel with me on Sunday night, I said just that to the audience. If you remember, I took out the dime and I said, if you hold up a dime in any black spot, up in the night sky, you're looking at 150,000 galaxies. Anywhere at any point, 150,000 galaxies, any point on planet Earth, and each one of those galaxies has got 500 million stars, and there's 500 million planets, and that concept
minimal,
and that concept wasn't even considered 10 years ago.
That's right.
And we are in a different time and place today. Going back to scientists and cosmology and astrophysicists, they understand this now. And if I had my choice, Adam, I'm serious too. If I had my choice, I'd want to be an astronomer today. What a great gig, right?
Yeah. Well, it's been a great gig forever. I mean, the opportunity and the way of looking at our place in the universe is something that can bring such a deep level of inspiration to all of us. And I think, to be frank about it, most people spend way too little time actually just looking at the sky and looking at the stars. I know people that have never seen a shooting star. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
It's impossible.
Just
right.
Literally stand here and look at the sky for longer than a few minutes and you will see one. It's that simple, but it's amazing because people just, they glance at the sky. Oh yeah, the stars. Oh yeah, there's clouds. Oh, there's the moon. And we instantly label, we instantly just write it off. But what happens when you start really paying attention to the space between stars? Well, now you start really observing what's going on out there.
What happened at 15? What was your awakening? What was that epiphany?
I had a really good friend, and he and I used to talk about some of these big questions that couldn't get answered in school. Like, how is it that you can feel it when somebody's looking at you from across the room? How is that possible? How is it possible that you could think about somebody and then they call you on the phone? Now, keep in mind, this was, in the 90s, and all you had was landlines, right? We didn't even have cell phones walking around in our pockets, but you'd think of somebody and they'd call on the phone sometimes. How does that happen? What's the functional physics of these kinds of things? Why do people's ears burn when somebody's talking about them? These are questions that I deeply wanted the answer to, and that there was no framework for in the physics, and that no teacher could answer. And I started experimenting with my friend and playing with a variety of different logical experiments and physiological experiments. And they led us to, a couple basic practices. And one of them, I was sticking my fingers together, just pushing the fingertips together very lightly. And then very slowly, I started separating the space between my fingertips, and I was just looking at the space between my fingertips. And I wanted to see if I had some interaction with my eyes, to my fingers, to this space that I was creating. And suddenly, I felt something, and I saw something.
You can see it, yes.
And it was a vibrational, fluid-like, smoky field between my fingertips. And then any of your listeners can do this at home. You just put your fingertips together, you very slowly bring them apart, you watch that space. And I also saw these little light flickers, and I could feel on my fingertips, especially if I bounced my fingers in and out, this little tingle, like a subtle vibration. And something inside my head just popped. I was like, oh my God. And for a moment, I thought, oh my God, this is the force. I found the force. Right. Like, the force is real. It was an epic moment for a 15-year-old kid, let me tell you.
Yeah. How old? Let me ask you, how old are you?
Right now, I'm 37.
You're 37. I'm going to be 56. But I was around the same age. I was like 15 when somebody, one of my tripped out older friends, showed me that the energy between your fingertips, right? Yeah. This is in the the late 70s. And that was a mind-blowing moment for me. I mean, I would practice it, and I got it down pretty good. I got it to change colors, too. Sometimes it would be green. Sometimes it would be white. Sometimes yellow and blue. I got a lot of blue. Anyway, moving on. Okay.
Well, I started to investigate this phenomena as a scientist and also as a martial artist. And so I started testing. Could my friend put something somewhere on the other side of the room and hide it and I not see where he's putting it or know where it is? And could I detect the feeling of that object with my fingers and locate it? So I started dowsing with my body. My friend, we also practiced martial arts and sparring and push hands together. So we started doing that blindfolded, and we started playing with how fast could we go, and could you go faster if I would just feel, using that little sense of the tingle, where his hand was going to be. And it was mind-blowing because we started literally having these massive breakthroughs, and I started playing with the charge in the field. I started filling my whole hands with it, showing other friends in high school, and they're just like, oh my God, like what is this that you're doing? What is that? And I'm like, I don't know. It's energy. It's part of life force. And I started realizing that it could be tuned to different frequencies, just like you describe, and really shaped to different elements like fire, air, earth, and water. And that a person feeling the ball in my hands that is, invisible and seemingly intangible could literally detect if it felt like fire versus if it felt like water. And I still do this practice. I teach this to people, and I have them create these little balls in their hands and pass them to each other. I did it at Contact in the Desert. And the look on their faces when they receive the thing into their hands and they realize that it actually feels like an element and they can tell the other person which element it is priceless, man. It's one of the greatest things, seeing people go, this is so real. And for me, I began investigating, like, what is this online? And the internet was, just budding. I'd come across sites on everything from GeoCities to AOL to whatever. And I began to discover that there were descriptions for the very things that I was exploring in all of these different traditions. From initially looking at elementals, I discovered Wicca and the Druid traditions, and they talk about using this energy of the elements to communicate with nature, and then discovered that what I was doing in martial arts was actually something called Tai Chi and Qigong, and that Taoist alchemists have been practicing this kinds of stuff for 5,000 years. And then in India, it turns out there is this thing called prana, and the prana moves through the body, and the body has these different chakras, and everything gets tuned. And I start discovering and exploring all of these different traditions all around the world who are all describing this thing that's completely missing from our mainstream view of reality, completely missing from school, completely missing from everything. And why? Is it because these things are connected to spiritual traditions? Is it because these things are considered esoteric? I wanted to know what the frick is going on,
right?
And why isn't this in our science?
And
that's what led me to physics.
And that's where I'm going next. We need to take our break right here. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Adam Apollo. Great conversation, Adam. We'll pick up where we are leaving off. You can follow Adam on Twitter at Adam Apollo. All of his links to a bunch of his sites are over at jimmychurchradio.com. Of course, follow me on Twitter at jchurchradio. Hashtag F2B is the sandbox. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Fade to Black I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, our guest is Adam Apollo. Tomorrow night, actor, comedian, researcher Rhys Darby is here. Thursday night is another Fader night. Open lines all night long. Our guest tonight, Adam Apollo. Now, Apollo, I just called you Apollo.
That's all right.
Let's go with that.
All my friends do. It's
Apollo. I actually, I'm watching Twitter here during the break, and our audience has gone through 7 years of shows, right? 1,100 shows plus Coast to Coast and everything else that I do out there. This is the first time that they've heard of you, and I'm watching. Right, Adam? Who is this tonight? And so your community and what you have built is quite large. You've got how many students? 35,000, right?
Yeah, it's about 40,000 across all the academies right now.
Right. And a huge infrastructure built, but all of that has been outside of the normal track of the UFO community, hasn't it?
Yeah, my work, even though I've had a lot of deep and powerful experiences in this space, and really that took off around 2005 or so, my work has been so deeply in the mainstream field. I've been a speaker at the White House and the United Nations. I've spoke at a lot of conferences and festivals around the world, and generally, the invitation to have me come and speak and present has to do with my work in education and in physics and in the future of human technology. And I've, delicately broached the topic in many cases, including at the United Nations and elsewhere. What does it look like if we're not alone? How do we approach becoming a planetary level civilization that's at peace with itself? And how do we bridge exopolitically with other species? But that part of my work has been more low key for a long time. And I have had certainly a lot of followers and people that know of that part of my work. But as you know, Jimmy, out there in the mainstream and in the fields of, education and physics and stuff like that, it's a delicate world. And all it takes is losing a sense of context of where someone's coming from. And all of a sudden you get thrown in the conspiracy theorist UFO box, and locked away in this sort of projection of no return. And so at this point in time, I'm really trying to build a bridge between these communities. And interestingly enough, a lot of my students across a lot of my academies, they get it. They know what's really going on. Because when you go deep enough in the study of physics and you look at ancient sites, or you go deep enough into self-development studies or into the arts, you, of course, find the keys and the insights that will bring you to a greater understanding of our role in the universe, our potential connection with other beings out there. And these kinds of things become more normal and more acceptable and interesting to investigate. But, walk into any university and do a presentation on physics and then end it with your talk about, your
galactic
experiences with starships,
right?
And they're like, "Wait, what?"
Well, today it is a bit different. It is fully mainstream media compatible. I'm talking about the subject of UFOs, where we've got it discussed now at the White House and with the Senate and the Navy, where it is not an embarrassing thing to bring up. And they are helping, people like you and myself, where we can freely go into this conversation now and not have the woo-woo tinfoil hat side of it tied to the subject. It's not that kind of party anymore, is it?
No, it's not. And actually, generally, people that have resisted this conversation are really the ones that have been wearing the tinfoil hat, so to speak. And that's not to say that every channeler and every transmission about extraterrestrial information is truthful or honest. And if you really pay attention to the disclosure movement, as I have since I met Stephen Greer back in 2001, you recognize that there's been a huge amount of disinformation put out there. And there's also been a lot of people that have done their best to share their experiences, but perhaps not had the scientific, logical context or a way to communicate it in a way that people could really approach it and feel, safe approaching it and actually deal with these kinds of issues in a logical manner. So, that's just part of any revolution. And we've seen that throughout history. Great thinkers bringing forth new ideas, big breakthroughs, and nobody wants to believe it's real until finally everybody realizes, oh yeah, of course, this makes sense.
Well, and you also, you have a way of presenting and speaking, which is, it's got a fundamental core to it. And watching what happened at Contact in the Desert, I'm the observer. I'm just the host of the panel, right? I'm just along for the ride. And we were speaking about spirituality, and you were speaking about spirituality. It was great. And then you went from that to talking directly about your extraterrestrial contact and your experiences and your knowledge. I could feel the tension in the room where you went from one direction to the other very smoothly, but you're speaking in a very pragmatic way. And I felt that the Contact in the Desert crowd was very receptive to you, and they had never heard you speak before. And this community, that's a hard line to cross. But I felt that you were very successful in that. What did you think about your reception out at Contact for the first time?
I was really pleased to be there. My main keynote talk, I almost packed the whole hall, and it was the other giant hall down at the other side from where we did the panel, the second biggest room, and I had an amazing standing ovation at the end of my talk. I finally actually have all of the edits of that talk. It's like a 7-camera shoot that was done for me by a wonderful videographer named Ruben Langdon, who has the #1 show on Gaia right now. It's called Interviews with Ed, and I am going to be in that show this fall. It's already been recorded, but they haven't released it yet. And he got great footage of that whole talk. So any of your audience can check that out. It's going to be posted on my YouTube probably within the next few days. I'm just waiting for the final edit to come through. And you can find me on YouTube just by Googling, Adam Apollo, and you'll find me there. And I also have a videos section on adamapollo.com, and it'll be at the top of there. And that presentation is sort of my most overarching magnum opus of understanding the connection between personal spiritual experience, sacred geometry, theoretical physics and unified physics, where gravity comes from, where electromagnetism comes from, what are the fundamentals of these things, how does this lead us to a more comprehensive understanding of our relationship to the universe, and then eventually I take that to applying that in advanced technological research, such as how do we build starship engines, how do we jump across the galaxy faster than light, what kind of interfaces do we need to be able to accomplish this kind of stuff. And so it's a great intro to, all of the depth of my work and the topics that I explore.
The concept of, let's get into some theoretical physics for a second. We can do the rest of the show on this subject if you would.
Yeah.
Which is,
if we're not careful.
Yeah, right. When we go back to a couple of things that have been, I don't want to say the Bible, but certainly the accepted dogma in physics, which is Einstein's field equations, special relativity, and the way that all of that was presented in its basic form, speed of light is it. Right? That speed, everything stops at the speed of light. There's nothing that can go faster than that. And if it did, these would be I'm talking about time travel. I'm talking about the reversal of things. So that has been accepted now over since around 1998, 1999, when dark energy started to come into play in the expansion of the universe, that the galaxies on the outside of the observable universe are now traveling faster than the speed of light. We can no longer see them. They are outrunning the speed of light, but yet nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, which now we are forced to go back and look at Einstein's field equations. Faster than light now, FTL is something that is openly discussed today. We went through almost 100 years now. If you go back to when Einstein first started to present these ideas and these theories, now we're starting to break away from that. Is it possible to travel at faster than the speed of light?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a caveat to all of this. And I wouldn't even necessarily say that Einstein didn't think it was possible to go faster than light. What Einstein actually was communicating is that if you attempt to accelerate to light speed, in other words, when you accelerate, you are creating gravity. It's what we experience as G-force. You hit the gas in the car, boom, right? You feel the force of the G's, the gravitational force pulling your body. You go up in a plane, you feel it press you down. You go down in a plane fast, you feel it lift you up. This is acceleration into a new direction. And when you accelerate in a new direction, what's happening is you're creating what we call a gravitational force. But what's really happening is that its space-time is actually warping slightly around you. So if you think of space-time as actually a literal fabric, and this is the breakthrough that I made in high school, and I'm not going to go into all the depths of it, but I started studying loop quantum gravity, the work of Lee Smolin, and I was looking at string theory, and I found that was just like super esoteric mathematically and way too abstraction. It just wasn't landing. But the reason it wasn't landing is because it wasn't dealing with space-time as this fundamental lattice, like an actual structure. And Lee Smolin and his team were trying to figure out, how do we study gravity at the smallest scales? Like, what is quantum gravity? How do we apply gravity in quantum mechanics? And what they found in their equations as early as the 80s was that the only way it makes sense that gravity is working at these small scales is if space-time is an actual fabric. It's actually literally a lattice made of light at the Planck scale. Now, there's a lot to unpack around all of that in order to really fully and deeply understand that. Listeners can go to my academy, the Resonance Academy for Unified Physics. It's a great place to learn about the basics of quantum gravity, how space-time works, how we are interacting with space-time, and even through to the course that I'm releasing this fall called Quantum Geometry, which shows how all of these things that we call sacred geometries are actually parts of the geometric structure of space-time itself. But I don't want to get into that too deeply, but I will say that what's happening when you're accelerating is that you're pushing your way through this fabric. And so you can think of it as the harder you push, the harder you accelerate, the more you're bending the sheet around you, the more you're bending the fabric. And what Einstein realizes is that if you keep doing that and you keep pushing harder and harder and harder, accelerating faster and faster and faster, it's going to take more and more and more energy to go faster and faster until it gets to a point where just to accelerate, it takes, nearly infinite amounts of energy. And this is why Einstein communicated that if you're accelerating, you cannot accelerate to the speed of light and actually hit that barrier. Now, the game changes. The caveat is that what if you don't accelerate? And what if you're not pushing your way through the space-time fabric? What if there was a way to simply jump through the fabric? What if there was a way to isolate the space-time tensegrity, so to speak, as to use a Buckminster Fuller term,
Right.
or the energetic construction of an object and its surface from the outside space-time, so that when it moves through that space-time, it's not pushing against the fabric. And, we might describe something that would do this as if it was in a higher dimension, which is an interesting idea because, a lot of people see these spaceships and they fly into mountains and they're like, wow, these must be higher dimensional beings. And yet, if you develop the technology to isolate the space-time around a craft from the surrounding space-time, you would be able to move through that surrounding space-time literally with no friction or intersection of any kind, including heat, electromagnetism, molecular tensegrity, or any of that stuff. You could literally fly into a mountain, you could fly into a sun, etc. So there's a basic physics principle to that. And we also know, because of quantum mechanics and the study of photons, that once you're already going light speed, that whole equation doesn't matter, because anything that's already at the speed of light exists in a state in which it's not influenced by time. So if you create a field of photons, how old is a photon? The answer is the photon is as old as the universe. How old is an electron? We don't know. In fact, John Wheeler, the guy who wrote the book on gravitation, it's actually the largest book you get when you go to school for physics. It's this massive book on gravity. Woke up in the middle of the night one night and called his buddy. He was like, oh my God, there's only one electron. And his whole realization of this and his experience of this, which you could call a spiritual breakthrough to some extent, was based on his realization and the idea that if an electron is moving at the speed of light, it's not experiencing time. And so it could literally move around every single atom in the entire universe, and it wouldn't matter. It could be distributed through the entire universe, and it wouldn't matter because it's moving at light speed or above, and so it's not experiencing time. And so these are major caveats that we see in physics, and they make possible the kinds of things that we witness, like teleportation, entanglement, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, but which is really just the realization that information exists in a standing field that is encoded by this fabric that we call the space-time continuum, or that we call the fabric of space-time, but that this fabric of space-time is made of light, and because it's made of light, it's moving at light speed in the way that it vibrates. And so there are potentials for information to transmit without passing through time at the most fundamental levels of the universe itself.
Let's stay right there for a second. Is information a constant?
Is information a constant?
Yes. Can it be destroyed? For instance, yes. Is it a constant? If you take that same fabric and it interferes and goes over the event or horizon of a black hole, is that information stable? Right? It is. It would remain stable at the singularity. Ripped apart, the information stays constant. Does it reassemble on the other side?
Well, this gets down to, what is space-time and what is information. And when you really get down to it, information, all we know of as information is basically frequencies of light at different patterns. All the information in our brain is like an electromagnetic frequency pattern, and the electromagnetic frequency pattern creates stabilization forms that involve our neurons and the way that our pions and axions connect with each other. But those are all just following charge routes, and they create consistent charge routes. In other words, consistent patterns of vibrational charge inside of our brain, which are just basically patterns of frequency or geometries of frequency. Now, when you look at all information as just basically patterns of geometry vibrating at certain frequencies, then it starts to make sense why somebody on the other side of the planet could have the same idea as you at the same time. Because who's to say that that frequency field and those geometries are just local to you? They're not necessarily. How is it that you could enter a dream and somebody else, on the other side of the continent has a dream with you, and you both experience the exact same dream, even though you're living on different sides of the continent and you see each other? And maybe if you're lucky, you happen to be friends and you're like, I had a dream about them. You're like, no way, I had a dream about you. How was it that you were in a shared information space at the same time? And this actually suggests that a lot of the ancient thinking about the astral plane and sort of these layers of our existence where we are able to commune with this field of information that is space-time are not only real, but they're actually just extremely practical tools that our body and our minds and our consciousness are built to use. We just have forgotten how to use them, or or they've been pushed so far down the hole of being evil by some religion or other that nobody wants to look at it anymore, when it's literally part of our natural biological mechanism. It's part of our consciousness. And so does information ever get destroyed? Well, is that even possible? Because when you look at an event horizon, for example, which is what we describe as that like limit where light is captured by a black hole and can never escape again. Well, just because light goes in doesn't mean the information is destroyed. And it also doesn't mean the information can't come back out again, because in order to have conservation of energy, you also have to have conservation of information, because they're one and the same, which means, and Hawking, was losing his mind over this, and lots of other guys, they're like, how does it go? Where does the information go? But people like Nassim Haramein have provided very elegant solutions for this, where literally, you have black holes nested throughout every scale of the universe, from a proton up to cosmological scales, and that the properties of a black hole's event horizon are simply that at the event horizon is where the internal information is entangled to the external information throughout space-time. And you also have a singularity at the core. And so the singularity can be a transmitter of information to any other singularity throughout space-time. And you also have the bridge of the individual to the collective, or the individual proton to, say, all the protons in your room, can be connected literally through what we call wormhole networks that are these sort of bridges off the surface of a proton. But what I realized is, and that, again, this is like mainstream research. This is major science. You can look in Scientific American and see John Wheeler and other guys talking about wormhole networks coming off of protons. And, it's this connection between the Einstein-Rosen bridge and EPR, which is the entanglement paradox. And what we're realizing in physics is that we are constantly entangled with space-time all around us, and the objects we interact with all the time, the people we interact with, we literally build faster than light Einstein-Rosen bridges of standing light waves between us and these other people and these other things. And those things are preserved even if we go further and further away from each other.
Well, it would also suggest, and we got to take a break here in 20 seconds, so you can give me a yes or no answer, but it would also suggest a direct connection to anywhere, right? Zeta Reticuli. It doesn't matter that that entanglement, that possibility is there throughout the universe, and it is instantaneous, where we're not talking about the speed of light, we're talking about now. Not later.
And what is the I? What is intention? What happens when we focus on something?
Let's take a break right here. Our guest tonight, Adam Apollo. I'm gonna give a quiz at the end of the show. This is Fade to Black. We'll be right back. More with Mr. Apollo after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. I guess tonight, Adam Apollo. You can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. The conversation's going down at hashtag F2B. Questions at hashtag F2BQ. You can follow Adam at Adam Apollo right there on Twitter. Now, okay, we're going to stay right here, man. I'm not letting this go. This is
all right, fair enough. Deeper down the rabbit hole, so to speak.
And see, the thing is I research this so much. It takes a big part of my day, but I'm more fascinated with it as I move along, and every day is new. But this is Leonard Susskind is somebody that I'm just fascinated with, and Brian Greene and others in the mainstream physics often say that the one thing that they want the answer to is what makes up our consciousness. What gives us our soul? What makes us us? How do we go from the atomic level of something without a brain, right, that assembles itself into us, where we can ask questions and laugh and have humor and study, and makes us like, how do we make that transition? And that is one of the biggest questions today in mainstream science, is just that. How does that happen? So I want your opinion on that. How do we make that transition from the atomic level of assembling of molecules and particles into sentient beings? And if we did go into a black hole, Apollo, you get sucked in, what happens to your soul? What happens to your consciousness? If you disassemble and you go down to the singularity, what happens to you? Can that be disassembled?
Good questions. And, not surprising that Susskind and Greene would focus on these things. I read Brian Greene's book, The Elegant Universe, when I was 16, and I thought it was brilliant. Did a great job of summarizing, everything from Einstein's theories of relativity to the sort of basics of quantum mechanics. And then he goes off into string theory and M theory and 11 dimensions. And, similarly, Susskind, both of them, they have a deep interest in sort of the music of the universe. And there's one thing that I relate with them around deeply, which is what I was talking about before, that when you get down to it, everything is a vibration. Everything is vibrational. Everything's harmonics. Everything is sound. Everything is music, And that's something we all kind of feel intuitively, that we're just surrounded by the music of the universe. And yet we're like, how is that actually happening? Like, what's really going on? Like, what makes the song of this wall different from my arm, or my eye or my body? And what is it about my body that's different from, an assemblage of matter that makes a chair?
Or a coffee cup.
Or a coffee cup,
right.
Or et cetera, right?
Right.
But here's the thing. When you really get down to it, I think that they've got the approach to consciousness backwards. The idea that somehow that these things assemble themselves into a format that makes consciousness possible is actually missing the fundamental point that they're actually trying to express through all the other physics, that the universe is music and that the universe is harmonic. I think that consciousness is embedded in the fabric of space itself. In other words, everything, to an extent, has the capacity for consciousness. Now, how well does that object or that thing communicate with you? Well, it depends on the object or thing. But I know certainly a lot of people out there, probably a lot of listeners, have had a moment when they got pissed off at their computer and they cussed at the computer, and the next thing you know, the computer crashes. Or, you're driving your car and you're like upset with your car and you're saying all this stuff about your car, and all of a sudden the car stereo stops working and the thing stops interacting with you as if it's mad at you. When I was, a young teenager, teenager, middle school years, I used to go and fix my mom's friends' computers, and they'd always start off by telling me how much of a effing piece of thing the thing is. And I'd be like, okay, yeah, all right, let me take a look. And so I'd sit down and I'd come in like, okay, what's going on with you? What's happening here? And I just talk to it nicely, and it would be working perfectly for me. And they'd be like, how is this working for you? And I'm like, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm not mad at it, And I started to see that this phenomena works all over the place. And then I started to realize, well, interesting. This is like what indigenous elders talk about. They have a relationship with the forces of nature. They have a relationship with these sacred objects that they treat sacred. This is what the Druids talk about. This is what Taoist alchemists talk about. You pick anywhere in the world and you find people back in time that realized that in order to have a better relationship with life and with, things that they wanted to experience, by honoring objects and actually interacting with the objects in different ways, they actually could change the result that they would experience in terms of their actual living experience with that object in their lives. Now, this could sound far-fetched to some people. This could be like, whoa, but just hear me out, because it's not that much further fetched than telepathic communication to other planets or seeing UFOs or any of these things. When you look at space-time itself as innately bearing the seeds of consciousness and carrying the information network, then what becomes really interesting is how does that information network surface? So as soon as you build a computer that has just enough things, a visual port and an audio port and a USB port and all these ways to interact with it, keyboard, etc., it becomes more and more capable of giving you feedback about your own consciousness, because it in itself is carrying that information structure that is your consciousness. Same with a car. And this is why I don't believe there actually is anything such thing as AI, because I believe once you have a vehicle, in other words, you build something that's sufficiently complex enough to provide its own feedback experience with space-time, register its own input and output of data, and be able to randomize its experience in space-time enough, in other words, toss the dice, see what happens, try something new, then what will happen is a soul, as you so poignantly put it, will actually incarnate, in other words, a standing field of consciousness that's not necessarily localized to any point in space-time, will come into that area of space-time in order to experience itself as that form of physicality. And this also opens up the sort of deeper space of awareness around certain extraterrestrial cultures, which you'll hear a lot about in channeling, and we'll probably talk about some on this show, where, you have this idea that certain beings and certain species have traveled from one species to another and, made the jump across the gap of space and incarnated as another species that their soul is compatible with, so to speak, in order to experience the space-time reality from that point of view. And that's exactly what I eventually learned that I experienced. I came to this planet in order to experience what it's like to be a human, and also to experience with many other species from around the galaxy what it's like to all be the same species. What's it like to merge? What's it like to be on a planet that's pre-enlightenment, pre-singularity? What's it like to experience the kinds of things that we experience here on planet Earth and go through its trials and tribulations in order to grow and to know ourselves more deeply and more presently? So that's the first half of your question. Second half
is you get sucked into a singularity situation physically, right?
Yeah,
you float in and you go and you stretch, and now you're a string of broken down stuff.
Sure.
And Einstein said pretty clearly that that's it. Everything is broken down and it is destroyed. And he wasn't even sure if there was energy left, right? We all know about these statements. But the question is if that, and I think that we're moving away from that, but he was pretty cemented in his ideas here. But what would happen to those that, the things that aren't necessarily tangible, like thought, your soul, your consciousness? Would you even know that you were sucked into a black hole, right? Would your mind survive?
Yeah, well, again, if consciousness is not necessarily limited to the vibrational structure of the molecules and the cellular structure that makes up your body, but is extended beyond it, and which is something that we see measurably on all kinds of scientific experiments. You can measure the heartbeats wave up to 50 feet away. You can detect the effect of observation or of intentionality on an object. Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Group has done a ton of research on that. And we see that we are having an influence that's not just local. And when we look at certain phenomena that is called remote viewing or astral travel, we start to realize that the consciousness of a being can separate itself from a body. And there's also researchers around death that have found significant changes in the moment that somebody dies, and something happens, at that point where there's something that's moving away from the body, and it's energetic, it's detectable. But where is this thing? Where is this body? Where is the soul? And if you go towards a giant macrocosmic black hole, like, the black hole in Sagittarius A at the center of our galaxy, yeah, you're going to be in the gravitational torsion forces pulling around that are going to literally rip your body and the ship and everything else apart, because it's literally, you're talking about the most powerful maelstrom of space-time that you can imagine. And yet, if you go right down inside the body, what is a proton? Every proton in our body is, calculated to be spinning at the speed of light at its, at its equator. And that, somehow a single proton, ask like, how long does a proton last? Well, the half-life of a proton is 4 lifetimes of the universe. So one proton has lasted from the beginning of time, as far as we know it, in this universe, and will continue to last 4 times that long. And it doesn't slow down. Why not? How does it keep spinning so fast? How is it still stable? How are the protons actually doing this? And the explanation that makes the most sense when you really get down to it is that every single proton is basically a little miniature black hole. It's got a singularity in it, and it's spinning at the speed of light right around its equator. The event horizon of the black hole is literally the charge radius of the proton. And Nassim Haramein's done some fantastic work on this, and he's a colleague of mine in this School of Unified Physics, the Resonance Academy, and has some amazing papers that explain the math and the science of exactly how this is happening. And it works. And yet it's also fantastic and beautiful. And if you went down to that scale, yes, the forces around a single proton are massive, massive forces. I mean, otherwise, splitting one atomic nucleus in a uranium atom, how does it, devastate at the scale that it devastates in an atomic bomb? I mean, you're literally talking about the power in a single atom. And so we have these massive forces at huge scales, but we also have them at small scales. And we're literally made of these forces that are gargantuan. And the vacuum catastrophe has showed us that even in the empty space all around us, even though it seems empty, it's actually just so finely tuned and highly balanced and in such perfect tensegrity as a fabric that we don't see all this energy. And yet, in a single cubic centimeter of empty space, literally it's been measured that we should have more energy than in the entire visible universe. And that's just a concept that will make anybody's mind pop for a second. Like, wait a second, what? The whole universe in a teaspoon? But but this is actually what we are embedded in. And to think that, the soul or the deeper construct of consciousness or information would be lost or destroyed in the many maelstroms of existence that we're embedded within, I think is short-sighted. Because after all, here we are. And we've made it this far, and somehow my body's holding itself together, even though I'm flinging around a planet traveling 1,000 miles an hour in the easterly direction while it's hurtling around the sun at 64,000 miles an hour, and the sun is moving through the galaxy at a few 100,000 miles an hour, and the galaxy is spinning with other galaxies in the Laniakea cluster. I mean, we are riding quite a ship here, and yet here I am just sitting in this chair, talking to you on this microphone. Everything seems perfectly normal and still, but it's not.
It's not. It's not. And if we take that concept one step further, which is if we go with time running in one direction, which I think the physicists of the world and the astrophysicists are starting to grasp the idea that our universe is not finite. It's actually very infinite and will continue to expand forever. And forever is a very long time. And so outside of our observable universe, those galaxies that are too old for that light to have gotten here, we'll never see them because they're expanding, and we will never know how much or who or what are there. But this is the interesting part of that. If those galaxies are now, and planets and down to the stars and the planets are FTL, are faster than light in their expansion, what does that do with Einstein in that once you pass the speed of light, you are now running backwards in space-time?
Well, it's all relative, Jimmy, because, again, in the local space-time where those galaxies are traveling, they're moving in a field of space-time that's moving. So, again, you're only dealing with these distortions of time, time dilation, and the effects of time dilation that happen from gravitational acceleration, et cetera, when you're accelerating relative to your local inertial frame. So,
let me jump in. Right there.
Sure. Yeah.
You and I are on a starship.
That's right.
Right? And we accelerate, and we're at 99.9999999% of the speed of light, right? You and I are nearly frozen in time as relative to Earth, to our original time. We are chasing a planet that is at 99999, point the speed of light. They are now relative to us. So isn't there space-time? What's the difference between that planet being a spaceship moving at that speed and us being on an actual spaceship attempting to travel at that speed and catch up to it? That's my point.
There certainly would be relativistic differences between different planetary systems and galactic systems that are moving in space-time at a different reference speed as compared to others. So, and that breaks all the way down to if one galaxy is spinning faster than another galaxy, there's huge differences there. And experiences of time passing are going to be different. But as soon as you enter the frame of reference of the space-time field that is local to that area, you're going to be experiencing the time at the same rate as those people in that place. It might be different from the way it is on Earth, but it's going to be local to that frame of reference. So in general, though, this is not something that we really need to ever experience outside of the thought experiment, because generally what we know is that we're surrounded in a galaxy by 200 billion stars. There's plenty of civilizations and stars that are all fairly, normalized in terms of our time frame of reference.
That's right. I agree with that.
But I mean, the galaxies that are at the edges of the universe, again, we're observing them as if they're accelerating faster than light. Because space-time may be moving at these incredible speeds, overall in that region of space. But again, we're also based on their distance, were looking into the past. And so maybe at some point, billions of years in the past, that area or region of space-time was moving drastically. And or maybe our perception of those galaxies is somewhat distorted because we're only just picking up the light from them from billions of years ago. And there was maybe a stabilization process before a civilization formed. It's difficult for us to ascertain, are there civilizations living at 99.9% of the speed of light somewhere else other than us? We don't know. We can't say. And will we ever have that experience of beings like that?
No.
Who knows? And if we did, we wouldn't know when we got there because we'd be back to normalization.
That's right. And that's the most fascinating part. I talked about this a couple of months ago, only that my mind goes, I read and listen to all of these physicists and it just forces me to go into fantastic thought. And one of them would be this. If you are in a galaxy that is now FTL, right? You can't even see it now. It's invisible, right? The light is now not with you relative. Do they, once they pass FTL, do they start to live in reverse? In other words, as they are expanding out, right, and they continue through the force of dark energy to increase, maybe they're double FTL.
Something else that's interesting, Jimmy, is that once you account, if you stop suggesting that stars in the galaxy are simply moving through space-time. In other words, they're pushing their way through space-time. Mm-hmm. And instead, you suggest that the entire galaxy and the space-time of around all those stars is actually what's moving. When you recognize that space is the thing that's moving all the way around, then all of a sudden the mass energy that we've lost, the so-called dark energy and dark mass, are basically negated, because the mass energy that's missing is actually the energy of space-time itself that's moving along with those stars and planets. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I'll just say is I don't think things go backwards after they go faster than light. I think that once you cross the light barrier, you are in sort of a different dimensional experience of time. In other words, relative to you, other things appear to be stopped. But that in that state, it's not. There's always going to be a relative local time frame. So, like, if you build a ship and you build an envelope around that ship, and you start traveling faster than light and jumping to other planets, it actually doesn't matter how fast you go over sea. There's actually a complete loss of relevance there at that point, because once you learn how to actually relocate your object in space-time, it can relocate itself to a new position at any speed, and everything in the surrounding space-time will still be in the same relevant time frame. In other words, you won't have time dilation.
Right.
So you can travel to other planets, you can come back, and your girlfriend's not 40 years older or 80 years older. You avoid all of those constructs as soon as you remove the time dilation effect, which is really just based on warping space-time or acceleration.
Is that where Einstein, that very paradox, is that where Einstein got it way wrong? In that if we did cross the speed of light in our starship, now we travel backwards. Now we never left where we came from, and that is impossible, right?
Yeah, it's impossible, and it's a paradox that I dealt with in high school a lot, and I started thinking of it that way. Like, what if you could get to a star and back to your planet before the light from that star reaches the planet? Would you have gone back in time? But again, that's suggesting that somehow you would be able to distort time to that level, and then that somehow you're distorting time to the point where you're going backwards in time. And I think that, is that something that's possible? Is it possible to time travel? I mean, I'm not going to say no. I'm not going to discount that possibility. Because I certainly think it's possible for information to travel through time to some extent. But but that this idea that you travel in a ship and you start warping space-time to this extent, this is what really violates Einstein's principles. And I think it's where he was actually right, is that you can't violate certain principles of causality in that format, because there is a limit to this sort of time dilation and acceleration thing. So anyway, we're going super deep down this road,
we're right where we need to be, man.
Right
Trust
where
me.
you want to be.
You see, but this is especially Einstein in some ways was a bit of a hypocrite. In that time traveling to the future in its basic form, just, traveling at a certain speed and returning back to Earth, you're going to return in the future. That would be a form of time travel. But traveling backwards in time, that gets a lot more difficult, if not nearly impossible. But yet, time loops for Einstein were okay. So it was something for me that I couldn't really wrap my head around. You can't have it both ways, and he wanted it both ways.
It was a conflicted time period, and when you really look at Einstein's work, you start with special relativity, in which all the guys around him, you got to think that it's also like the way the media, the press, and the other scientists are interpreting his work, right? So he releases special relativity, defines the photon, defines how light works, and all of a sudden everybody's like, woohoo, there's no such thing as the ether. We don't need the luminiferous ether anymore.
Right.
Yay, we can get rid of that because now we know how light works. 10 years later, Einstein publishes general relativity, and all of a sudden he's talking about this space-time fabric, which is bending light. And that everything is regulated by this underlying fabric, which he calls space-time. And his teacher, Lorentz, is like, Einstein, you just proved that the ether exists. And Einstein's like, oi, I did. And he realized that he just proved that the ether exists. So what he does next is he does a paper on the ether, and he writes about how basically general relativity requires this underlying ether, this fundamental field of space-time energy, which would prove, the philosophers were right throughout history, that there is a such thing as elementals, that, all of these things were wrapped into the ether, these ancient spiritual traditions. And yet here's Einstein, and he's very directly saying the ether exists and you can't have general relativity without the ether. But you know what happens? Everybody ignores it. Nobody listens to him. It's kind of like, he's the crazy old man.
Yeah, I know. He wrote. I got to take a break right here, but he almost wrote too many papers. Right? He should have just stopped with general and special and let things ride. That's my opinion.
The ether theory, though.
We'll be right back. Our guest tonight, Adam Apollo. Stay with us. Welcome back. Fade to Black. What a great conversation tonight with Adam Apollo. I promise that. There will be a quiz later on tonight. You can follow Adam on Twitter at Adam Apollo. And all of the links, not all of the links, but a lot of the links to his different websites are right there at jimmychurchradio.com. Now, Adam, okay. There's always this one fundamental question. All this talk of physics is great. All of this quantum and string theory, this is all great. But how is E.T. getting here? Now, we said earlier tonight, and I talk about this nearly every night on the show, about the size not only of the universe, but just our Milky Way is ginormous. There's probably up to around 1 trillion planets in our Milky Way. 1 trillion planets. That's a crazy number that has been creeping up. It's probably going to get bigger. Yeah. Out of that, we are talking about not tens of thousands, not millions, but maybe 1 billion or 2 intelligent civilizations out there. How many of them know about planet Earth? Well, probably thousands and thousands. Just a crazy number.
Sure.
How are they getting here? It can't be from the same technology, or are they sharing it? How are they getting here?
Well, in my experience, both through having contact experiences and also through asking lots of really hard questions in conversations with some of my star family that's out there, I've unpacked a lot of that. And, I'm not sure that this show's the right place to tell that whole story, but I'm happy to do it. There's a show that I'm on called Interviews with Ed that I mentioned earlier.
I've seen
Reuben Langdon's show.
I've seen them all.
In that show, in the episode that I'm in, that's going to be coming out soon, I tell really the full comprehensive story of my direct contact experience, where I met a physical extraterrestrial ambassador in the middle of the desert, and then I started having these direct contact and communication experiences where I'd call in ships, I'd talk to them, have telepathic communication of different kinds. They would show me things, they'd confirm things for me in the way that they fly in the sky, as well as through people around me, and did a huge amount of study into what I call transpersonal psychology projects, which is looking at people's memories, direct experiences, and dreams, and looking for valuable data that verifies and crossovers and validates other data that you gather from other people's experiences, and looking logically at a field of 100 people that have basically described the same exact planet and don't know each other at all, and yet all have similar experiences of this planet, all describe their species the same way. I look at that as valuable data, whether it's true or not. It's valuable that 100 people, that I happen to come into contact with, all describe this place the same way. And so as a researcher, that kind of stuff is really important to me. But what I found in the sense of technology traveling faster than light, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And some of those ways we've actually seen replication of on this planet, because there have been craft that crashed, and we've had reproduction vehicles built, or ships brought back online. And one thing that seems to be pretty standard about the technology of the kinds of ships that have actually crashed on our world, which tells us something about their level of technology, is that they seem to be super highly intense electromagnetic fields, and particularly magnetic fields. And that through very, very powerful magnetic fields, you can begin to warp space-time around an object, and that can distort gravitational fields. And then, because as you move space-time, you're moving gravity, and then also allow that object to accelerate and or jump or warp when traveling through space. Now, that's interesting technology to me, but it's not at all to any that's basically like a Nokia, flip phone with a liquid crystal display versus like the new iPhone 11 Pro, right? Like in terms of technological difference between something like that and something like the stuff that the Pleiadians and Sirians and Arcturians drive. And at that level, their technology is literally forming these isolation fields around a craft. So the way that I've described it many times, and I've done lots of presentations on this and gotten deeper into the physics than I'll get into this, in this talk, but that basically you need a containment system for the internal space-time field. So you have to create a spin field or a spectral vibrational frequency spin field around the area that's inside the craft to such an extent that it has a livable environment, it has a basic gravitational field. And then you need a second layer of what I call the ring system that is causing the disruption in space-time. In other words, it's literally matching the geometry of space to such an extent that the internal space-time and the external space-time suddenly detach from each other. So you're creating a break in the space-time field. And then there's an outer ring that stays tuned to the inner ring, so it stays connected in the structure architecturally of the ship, which the job of that ring system is to literally create a field around the craft that is communicating to space-time the basic frequency information of where that craft is located. So an object, once it's free from the general gravitational vortices of a planetary system, solar system, galaxy, etc., in other words, once it's achieved sovereignty in its own space-time field, and it's disconnected from the surrounding space-time, so it's got to like bubble around it, so to speak. Now the question is, how does that object move? Well, in order for the object to move, it has to create a torsion effect on the surrounding space-time, which means that the field of light, or the field of space-time at the edge of the bubble, the event horizon, so to speak, has to communicate to the surrounding space-time what's going on in that bubble and how it's moving and spinning. Now, there's ways to move that field in such a way that it propels you or just makes you move and travel in a certain direction. But there's other ways where that entire field can literally match the field of space-time in a very, very distant location. And one thing that they've showed me a long time ago is that, you know, if you're trying to jump a spacecraft across the galaxy, it's pretty difficult to just use information of the stars in that general region of the galaxy, because from your standpoint, those stars might be, 5,000 light years away or 10,000 light years away. So the actual spectral frequencies of the stars that you're reading are the way that they were vibrating 5,000 years ago.
That's
or
right.
10,000 years ago.
Right.
And stars get older, right? So stars evolve and they burn up parts of their elements, and they have a very specific spectral frequency that we can measure. The spectral analysis of stars is for anybody who wants to look this up. And yet that's going to change over time. So what you need is some kind of beacon system of stars that don't change as drastically within these sort of large time frames. And it turns out we have a beacon system just like that, and they're called pulsars. Pulsars have this incredibly clean, measurable, energetic frequency change over extremely long periods of time. We're talking thousands of years. So they can be thousands of light years apart. And yet, you see a pulsar that's 1,000 light years away, you measure its pulse for a very short amount of time, and you have an extremely predictable level of frequency change and vibration, and even its movement over a certain period of time can all be predicted fairly easily. And now you've got a beacon point that can be one of 3 points that you're triangulating a new position between. And that new position is basically an area of space-time which has a specific sort of combination of vibrational frequencies that are local to that area. And what's happening in the craft is telling the surrounding space-time where the craft is now located instead of the other way around. So instead of like, I'm looking outside of me and I know I'm sitting in a chair in my office and there's my library over here, and I know where I'm at because I'm receiving light bouncing off of all these objects telling me where I am. It goes the opposite way, where the object, this craft, is actually telling space-time, this is what my surrounding frequency field is. And space-time doesn't know any different. It's the same thing as if in your mind you close your eyes and you imagine you go outside, or you imagine you go in the backyard, or you imagine you fly up above your house. When you get really good at this, you realize that you're capable of seeing these locations and these areas exactly like they are, whether or not you've ever floated above your house. And it turns out that after a little bit of practice, you can actually get information. So you can go float above your house and you can look down the road and you can see a car that's sitting there that's not usually sitting on your road. And you can come back down, get in your body, go outside and look, and sure enough, there's that car. And this is called remote viewing. But this is a practical application of the ability of consciousness to perceive space-time from whichever position it wants to relatively. and applying that technology to superluminal spacecraft, or a craft that's able to move faster than light. In other words, that's able to separate itself from the surrounding space-time enough to be able to move without accelerating, is critical to being able to jump across the galaxy and relocate yourself to another star system or another planetary system. And it all actually becomes very practical when you start realizing it's literally just communicating with the frequencies of light that are embedded in the local space-time of any region.
So what would this speed, are you traveling at the, I'm wondering if motion is the right word. Well, exactly. Are you traveling at the speed of gravity?
Yeah, it's just the speed of now. I mean, literally,
right.
The object is, at one moment it is in this local area or region of space-time, and then when it changes its field around it to communicate to space-time that it's now in this new location, it's now in that new location. Like literally, it's just there. It's displaced itself from its current position in the space-time fabric, and it's now locally, located near other space-time. Now, that doesn't mean it can't move. Like I said, you can pulse the light field in such a way that allows you to travel, with angular momentum and speed, but it doesn't. You're separated from the space-time field, so of course you can make a 90-degree turn. It doesn't matter. There's no G-force when you do that. You just literally just start going that way. And on the inside of the craft, nobody feels anything because it's just moving around as easily as you move with your mind.
Now, I understand how that would apply to space, but what does that do once you're inside of atmosphere?
Yeah, so atmospherics, it gets a little bit interesting, right? So if you have a craft like this and it's literally, blurring the space-time continuum around it, creating this kind of isolated envelope, you're not going to be interacting with atmosphere at all at first because you're literally in separate space-time as if you're in a higher dimension. But as soon as you turn off or you break down that layer, which you have to do in order to interact with the atmosphere or with a planet, or say land, or say do something like make a crop circle or whatever, you've got to open part of that field. And when you open part of that field, you're going to have an atmospheric burnup happen. In other words, there's often going to be light show up around the ship. It's going to be the auroras. The electromagnetic field is going to light up. And this is what people see a lot of times when a ship comes in and it burns up real bright. It's because they're literally releasing that space-time field so that their craft becomes visible and it becomes fully present. It's not cloaked, it's right there. And then they can turn it back on and shoot off if they want to. And farmers often see this kind of stuff over their fields. They see these little blips of light come down, and then they see these bright flashes, and the next thing they know, there's a giant crop circle that's out in the field. And so there is a limitation to how much you can interact with space-time once you're inside of this gravitational envelope. So you got to turn it off to some extent, which is going to have an effect. And I think some ships, in my experience, have different other ways to modulate gravity. So when they fully turn off that field, if they want to hover, they're going to use things like sonic amplifiers, and they're going to just literally vibrate the atmospheric field underneath the craft in such a way that, it literally is able to just hover through this massive kind of sonic pressure that they're building up with the atmospheric field, which then that kind of thing, when you look at it in terms of its physics, explains why a lot of people, they see a craft come down and then there's this this pulsing sonic field while the craft is right around their house, or whatever.
Is it visible, though? Is it visible? And does this answer some of the interdimensional aspects of this? Certainly with craft that I have seen that have just appeared and then disappeared.
Yeah.
Right?
It's just it's just when you've got that separation field on that's separating them from their surrounding space-time, it's just as easy to be invisible as it is visible. So they can literally just not be there and then be there. and it's just literally a matter of them setting that boundary and the conditions of that boundary between them and the surrounding space-time. They can show light or not.
Who in various governments around the world and state actors understand this, or do they completely not understand it?
Well, I think that in general, what I've gotten from studying the disclosure movement, and I've met some very interesting cats in my time. I had an ex-Black Ops friend of mine show up at a Psytrance party in Asheville, North Carolina when I was in college, and we became close friends. And he used to do psychic warfare training for the military. And I wasn't sure he was being honest until he took me to dinner, and we were at this guy, this old guy's house who was, basically ex-FBI, really high up in the FBI. And he had photos of himself with presidents and stuff. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, this guy actually is who he says he is. But what I've really gotten is that, it's a mixed bag because one, of compartmentalization, two, people that have been studying these kinds of technologies, generally it's just the technologies they've been exposed to and they've been allowed to study and allowed to understand, which then theories develop and physics develop around the study of those specific technologies. But, when you're dealing with something like a ship that crashes on Earth, which is a lot of the ships that I think we've recovered are all Zeta Reticuli based technology, or species that's generally referred to as the Greys. And their level of technology is just vastly lower than that of what I call the Galactic Council, which is a group of species who are completely open source. They trade all their tech with each other, to answer an earlier question that you had. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why they have this incredibly peaceful community across the galaxy, is that they all are at this super high level of technology, very high level of spirituality and honoring and ethics in terms of life and consciousness and creation. And they look at it as, if you don't just give away everything that you learn and figure out, then what happens is people start trying to fight over information or fight over knowledge or fight over technology. But when you share all your breakthroughs, everybody benefits all the time. And it's just amazing how fast everything evolves. And, there's just more and more community that builds and forms itself in that way. So I think when our government and other governments have witnessed technology of the kinds that I'm talking about from this Galactic Council community, they don't know what to think. I mean, I think that kind of stuff scares the shit out of them, because it's so far beyond anything that even they might know about in terms of their study of these crashed spacecraft. Something like a weapons system, like to shoot down a ship like this, is just literally impossible, because you're literally dealing with a force field that's made of space-time itself. It's like they're so far beyond the state of warring, and partially because of this kind of technology. Like, you can't have a war if there's no way to get to the space-time of your enemy.
Right.
And so, like, the ideas of battling over resources and stuff like that just becomes completely ridiculous at this point, because you can generate whatever forms of matter you want from space-time itself. In other words, space-time is programmable. And these kinds of things are a huge leap for the consciousness of a species that in general is still pretty well caught up in scarcity mentality, and the idea that, if others have more than them, then they're in danger. That you always have to be the biggest dog in town, like all these kinds of things. These are just, it's just our adolescence phase, so to speak.
Let me jump in. Well, let me jump in really quick. And also, we're going to be heading towards a break, and obviously we're not in any position to end this conversation tonight. So I invite you to stay with us, and we'll do some overtime. But with not to dive into the Fermi paradox, but what the Fermi paradox represents, and you brought up the Drake equation earlier, and other astronomers around the world and cosmologists will say this sounds fine. The numbers suggest all of this intelligent life, but we can't see it. We're looking, we would see the interstellar trading, we would see the galactic freighters, we would see these types of craft moving around, and we don't. How do we explain that part of it? Or is the bubble construct that you're describing here take care of all of that, where we wouldn't see necessarily physical interstellar travel?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's somewhat hubris to think that we would just see all of it, because, it's interesting, but I mean, how many years has it been that we've even recognized that there's planets around other stars? Right?
5.
We're right. 5 years. We're finally like, oh, there are planets around other stars. Oh, gosh, I can't believe we didn't realize that all this time. So you're talking about a planet, and then you're trying to compare that to a freighter ship. And let's say the freighter ship is the size of New York City. So now you're trying to say, oh, can you see something the size of New York City, or smaller, floating around in that solar system over there? Yeah, not likely. And also, not to mention that when it decides to move to another solar system or decides to travel across the galaxy, it's just jumping straight there. It's not like traveling across the whole distance, and like here's a little satellite moving across the sky.
Right.
It's just there, And so a lot of these things are, of course, going on, and we do see very interesting stuff all the time. I mean, there's some pretty interesting studies of our looking at the sun and seeing very, very large objects in some of the solar observatory fields, of objects kind of hovering right next to the sun and absorbing a bunch of, what looks like absorbing electromagnetic energy out of the sun into like a big sphere, and then the thing disappears. What the heck is that? And we have, lots of testimonies about either bases on the backside of the moon, of people seeing spacecraft. It's a pretty simple matter that, the fact that there's a lot of people that haven't even seen shooting stars. A lot of people have never had a direct experience of a starship or seen anything in the sky. There's a lot of reasons, and not to mention the belief systems of most people that are simply resistant to the idea of seeing this kind of interplanetary, interstellar network, not to mention galactic scale network, not to mention potentially intergalactic network. And we also are lacking some basic observational technologies as well to be able to detect them at scale.
Yeah, they could be operating at a much slower or much faster rate, their life, where we simply just can't see it. It's just simply out of range of our current tech, and it's completely not observable.
I wouldn't take it that far, but just the ability to surround your craft with an envelope that isolates it from the surrounding space-time and travel faster than light, like that already is such a leap ahead that, our ability to observe something and even know what kind of cloaking is possible or not is, extremely limited.
Let's take our break right here. Our guest tonight, Adam Apollo. Fantastic conversation, Adam. Stay right there. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, doing some overtime with Mr. Apollo. When we come back, you can follow Adam on Twitter at Adam Apollo. The links are right there in the conversations tonight. And, of course, you can follow me at J Church Radio. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. Look who just popped up in the Fade to Black chat. Adam Apollo. Adam, you have no idea what door you've just opened.
I like all of them.
Yeah, it's great, man. It's great. We do thousands of tweets, and every single night, it's just out of control. So hashtag F2B is what you want to do, and that spreads out.
Yeah, these guys are fun, and I'll just say I rarely actually use Twitter, so it's not the best way to find me or keep in touch, but I'll use it a little bit more. I think my Instagram got disconnected from my Twitter, but it used to post kind of regularly through that. But you can easily find me there on Instagram, Adam_Apollo, or just go to AdamApollo.com, and there's lots of ways to see my work and see what I'm doing.
Yeah, Twitter's going to get big, I heard. Yeah,
someday.
All right, yeah. Let's head into some overtime. And I know that everybody is curious. We danced and moved right past. By the way, Ruben Langdon, one of my heroes. Just an extraordinary, not only as a person and an actor and a martial artist and all of the gaming stuff that he has done, it's just an incredible career, but he's a really, really good filmmaker. And I'm glad that he's grounded into some bliss right now and is heading down this road. And it's just really cool that you're working with him. But let's get back to what we danced past, which was your encounter, a physical encounter in the desert with E.T. What happened?
Well, like I said, it's a long story, and if you want the full story, you'll have to watch the episode with Ruben. But I will say here, just to kind of make it simple, I'd love to just describe to you my interaction with this being, who showed up out of the blue in a moment when I had just gone through a whole series of really powerful healing experiences and come into a little deeper sense of myself and who I am and why I'm here and the purpose of my life. As any deep journey can be, when we go through a series of transformations and we come out the other side, and we finally, in this sort of deeply awakened state, start to realize what it is that we're doing here in the universe. And I mean sober, I mean spiritually aware of what we're doing here in the universe. There's breakthroughs that can happen and things that can happen. And I was just in a point of realizing literally that, literally in the moments right before she showed up, there were two things. One is that I realized that there's people all over the world that would be absolutely interested in making contact if that was possible. And that something different, something weird, something out of the ordinary, something more like the Star Trek movies they like or whatever would be something that people would actually be into, right? For one thing. And I also realized that, that as much as it's difficult for us to see kind of this next level of being and what it might be like to travel the stars, most people are really open to it. And I don't know, there's all kinds of people in my life when I go out to the store who are working at, the grocery store or working at the gas station or here or there. And man, they would love nothing more than for ships to land and for them to get on and go explore other planets. I mean, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty fun thing to leave your day job for, right?
If the food is good. If the food is good.
If the food is good. that is definitely a caveat. And I will say that on Earth here, we humans have certainly cultivated our love of exotic cuisine in such a fabulous way. I love food. I'm a foodie absolutely.
Well, did you understand at this moment? Did you understand what was happening?
Yeah, well, she was physically standing there, just looking at me, and she's in these robes that hung down her body, and there's these little symbols on her robes all along from the cowl going all the way down the front of the robes that look like constellation patterns, and they're kind of glowing and shimmering. And she's just staring at me. And I I'm kind of squatting down, and I stand up and I walk over to her, and that's when I realize, as I'm getting closer, that she is not human, because humans have, every human being I've ever met, we all have this one particular quality to our skulls. As a Homo sapien and even Homo erectus, and you look at all of us, you've got these eyebrow bones, and the eyebrows come down to the sides, and we all have this little, bone point where there's the edge of the eyebrow, and it kind of closes the eye cavity and goes down. And, everybody's got it. Everybody's got an end to their eyebrows. Everybody's got a certain shape to their eyebrow bone. And that shape is pretty much defined in our human species.
Well, we recognize that from the time that we're a baby, looking at our mother's face, and that's it. It is part of our DNA to recognize another human being.
That's right. And it's across, even though you put me next to a Nigerian guy or a Japanese guy, we all have very different look. But if you look at our skulls, and you look at the shape of the bone structure in our skulls, we have these very, very similar qualities. And when I looked at her, she didn't have that end point to the eyebrow bones. Her eyebrow bones went back further out to where her temples are, and then there was an edge to that hollow point. So the hollow around her eyes extended much further back. And she still had beautiful kind of human-shaped eyes, not very big, but just there. And she generally looked human. But she also had these little bone points coming off in her forehead, little bone points coming off her cheeks, and was very beautiful. Her ears actually extended back to points. That's fakeable, of course. Mm-hmm. But this eyebrow bone thing, there's just no way. You couldn't do it. I mean, even when you watch Star Trek and things like that, and they have all this makeup and they build up the faces in all these ways, you still got that spot in the eyebrows. You just can't lose that.
Can't fake it.
And then that was my first whoa, okay. And then I get about as far away from her as if I reached out my arm and she reached out her arm, our fingertips would touch. And when I reached that point of distance from her, all of a sudden she was in my head. And it was like I put on VR goggles and headset and everything, and she spoke into my mind with what I could best describe as a immersive holographic light language that said to me, "I know who you are." And that expression was snapshots of flying in on this massive starship and docking my ship with it, and then being on this room with these huge windows looking down at a planet below, and then being in this massive room that's kind of akin to the one in Star Wars where all the different galactic beings meet, this kind of rounded council chamber, to basically flying down, seeing Earth, to be standing in these giant standing stone circles on Earth looking up, and I'm seeing a ship coming down and it's beaming down on this altar, to just all of these moments and flashes standing in the deserts of Egypt, and there's a ship coming in and a storm blowing, and there are these memories, there are moments of my existence in which I had some connection with this being, and she was literally transmitting to me a memory or memories of these moments of connection that we had. And so there was this instant feeling of deep familiarity, of deep recognition. I also saw the symbol that I would wear, on my coat when I was going into these, meetings as different species. And there was just all of this sense of instant familiarity. And I just thank you, and I felt this massive, deep gratitude for this moment of recognition. It was the most powerful telepathy I've ever experienced.
Now, how did you return the telepathy? Right? You're not learned in telepathy at this point.
No, all I did was think, thank you, and feel the feelings I was feeling, and she just could see it. It was like transparent as day, like the same way, if you tell, your daughter or someone in your family that you love them in a really deeply authentic way, and you literally watch them light up, you can see how they receive it. It's, how she received it from me.
What happened next? What happened next after this introduction?
Well, I happened to not be alone in this desert, and there was
Reuben,
a couple guys.
Was Reuben with you?
No.
Okay. Okay.
I didn't know Reuben back then. I didn't even meet Reuben actually until this last year. So
okay.
There was these two guys that came up into this space that I was in at the time, and the two guys were basically like rednecks, and literally orange still chainsaw hat on one of them, and they're drunk and they're tripping and they're having an adventure out here, and they come up and they look at her and they're like, whoa man, what is this? And like look at each other like, what the fuck? And they're looking around in this space, which is an art piece, and there's more to the story, but I'm not going to get into too much detail in this conversation. And she looks over at them, and what she transmits back to me is, not all of you are ready. And that transmission came with, if you ever saw the movie The Fifth Element, the moment when it's like, she looks up war. And it's like, I see these guys and they're like shooting off their shotguns and they're shooting things. And then one of them's getting his head shaved, and then now he's in the military, and now he's shooting a machine gun, and now he's listening to heavy metal, and now he's shooting a tank, and now he's blowing up this thing and he's blowing up that thing. And there's this whole cascade of imagery of just like, someone just living their life. It's not that what they're doing is bad. It's just that the way that this kind of chain goes is to a lack of care for life, and a lack of understanding of others, and a lack of awareness of really like, who are you destroying? Like, why are you destroying them? Do you really know? Are you just doing it because your country says it's a good idea? Do you actually know why you're at war? Do you actually know, all of these different questions come up. And I could see the kind of pain of humanity in which like a lot of people are stuck in hard places, and they're not necessarily ready for this sort of leap, in terms of the way it seems in their consciousness. And when I saw that and I felt that, I also was looking at these guys, and I spent my middle school and high school years in Western North Carolina, and I partied with some guys that lived way back up in Caney Fork, and a place called Little Canada. And man, we threw down hard, you know what I'm saying? Like, we did keg parties, we rocked it out, we had a damn good time. And I know these guys, like, they're my friends, like, they're my homies. And I saw some of them get beaten by their dads. I saw some of them deal with like, they stop caring about the grades they get in school because all their parents care about is they're doing FFA because their dad's like, you're going to take over the farm. That's what you're doing next. If you don't listen to me, you're going to military school. And I saw the lack of choice and the lack of options that some of these kids had. And I realized that that's true across the board, that a lot of kids grow up and they are trying to fit the model that their parents have laid out, or try to fit society in some way, and they don't have a way to get there, and they get forced into these situations where they're struggling, and they're literally fighting against the society and consciousness and all of these different things, and get caught up in fights and in war, and it's all based on trauma. And I sent her this sort of sense of my awareness of the fact that war is based on trauma, that a lot of these guys, it's not their fault, that these guys are my friends and I love them, like, I didn't know these two guys, but they could have been friends of mine from high school. Sure. And I also sent her that sort of love and compassion that I felt for them. And I also said, and enough of us are. And I sent her an images of, all of these different friends that I'd had and that I'd made over the years, who just, had a spark of light in them, and they just wanted more than anything to make a difference in the world. They just want more than anything to make a change that's big enough or that's drastic enough that somehow the wheel and the cycle would be shifted, and their children wouldn't have to deal with the same kind of pain and challenges that the environment would make it through this adolescence of humanity, and we'd see through to the other side of this sort of major growth spurt that we're going through as human beings, and survive and have a planet that's beautiful to pass to our kids. And there's all of these beautiful people doing great work in the world right now, and a lot of them are listeners on your show that are dedicated to making a change in the world for the better and for our generations to come. And that's something that I felt deeply, and she received very deeply. And the look on her face shifted, her eyes sparkled, and suddenly I felt this wave of love hit me, and she bowed to me and she sent me this energy, and she said into my heart and into my being with light and sound and visuals, "Thank you for honoring your people." And it was just this overwhelming sense of love. And I just felt like, oh my God, I just like passed a test.
Right.
This was a test. She was just testing me. And it was like, and I felt this love so strong. It was overwhelmingly powerful. And I just bowed to her and, put my head and my hands together and bowed to her, and just so much gratitude for this moment and this experience with her. And then I came up from the bow, and she was gone. And the redneck guys were still there. Other people in the area were still around, but she was nowhere to be seen.
Have you seen her since?
No, not in the physical. But I have connected with her, and she spends time in the Sirian star system. But that's certainly part of another story.
Yeah. I just got to ask the dumb question, right? Sure. The two redneck guys, the still chainsaw hat. What did they say? I mean, what was the reaction after she wasn't there?
Oh yeah, well, there's a moment where I was actually massively thankful for this moment. But, one of them, after looking at this art piece that is part of this area that I was in, looks over and she's gone. And he's like, glances around like, where did she go? Mm-hmm. And that moment of him looking for her, man, it was such a relief for me, because, my logical brain and I was literally just in like a VR telepathic field with a being that was so powerful. It was, stronger than any psychedelic I've ever taken. And it was just so intense and so real and so potent, what I felt from her. And then she's gone, and then here's this guy who's just like as earthly as can be, as human as can be. And he saw her and he sees that she's gone. And I'm like, okay, that was real, like it was one of those moments where it's like anybody would question themselves after having an experience that powerful.
Well, you've always looked at the world differently, but certainly after an experience like that, you forget the redneck guy. Yeah. You have to look around and go, okay, well, I was thinking things weren't the way they seem, but now I know that things are not. How did it change for you from that moment forward?
Well, from that moment on, I actually went out to go and make contact. And, I won't tell the rest of the whole story because it's just a lot to tell. But I did literally from there, I went out and had an experience of bilocation where I astrally traveled to this Galactic Council chamber in which I saw and witnessed at least 73 different ambassador groups from different species from all over the galaxy Why 73? I don't know. It's the number that my brain pulled out, and it's just was there in the moment that I had the experience. And I ended up in a deep and powerful conversation with them for many hours after this, in which I came to know and understand who I was a little bit better, and also like what the heck we're doing here and what's going on, and why are these species not landing on the White House lawn, as people like to say. And I saw on your Twitter feed. And when it comes down to it, I'll give you the summary of some of my realizations from that conversation. And that's that, we are, as I mentioned before, in an adolescent phase as a species. We're literally coming to a point where, for the first time since before the end of the last ice age, we're connected across the entire planet. We have the ability to communicate with each other instantaneously all over the world now. We have technology that backs up our capacity to develop telepathy. But telepathy is coming. We are already starting to speak more languages and merge and realize that all languages are in some way connected to a higher language that's the language of thinking and mind and information itself. And we can translate things instantly using our digital technologies. And as we come into this maturation cycle, we are preparing for this sort of great orgasm of Gaia, of this sort of height of evolution of Gaia, where the human species is released out into the galaxy and gets to go and explore and play and share all of our realizations and our gifts with these other worlds, and receive the gifts from these other species as well, to bring our planet back into balance and to make it through this grand game of being and evolution in life. But in order to do that, there's certain very fundamental realizations that we need to go through as a species. And in order to go through those realizations, we have to face the potential of our own extinction. We have to face the potential of our own death. And that, looking at our shadow, seeing our darkness, seeing how we've abused nature, seeing how we traumatize our kids, and seeing how, the cycles of time and war and all the things that we've been through as a species, and all the things we like to hide, the stuff we don't like to talk about. The ways we, might go to church and be like stoked to like sing a song about Jesus, but then we don't want to talk about all of the people that got slaughtered across Europe because they were herbologists, right? Or if you're Muslim, like dealing with the shadow, like facing our shadow, facing our own darkness, facing the things that we've done wrong is critical to us coming into greater responsibility for who we actually are and making the kinds of new choices in the moment that are going to pave the way to a future that actually is equitable and good for all life. And it's a massive transformation process and a realization process. And it looks nasty because just like a butterfly, we're worms and we're going into the chrysalis and we're at battle with ourselves. But, there's this amazing thing, and it's called the imaginal cells. And the imaginal cells are like those of us that are waking up and popping open, and we're realizing, all the truth to these things. And we're getting clear, and we're questioning. We're asking the really hard questions. And we're not just stopping there. We're keeping going until the truth is seen. And that's creating pressure where the old structure is breaking down and falling apart. And then through those imaginal cells, literally working together, connecting together, we're forming a new structure that transcends and includes the old one. So no one gets left behind, but we literally begin to generate and gestate this new form of being, this new species that we're becoming in order to become part of this galactic community. And, you can't, if they've come down to this planet so many times over history, they've brought technologies, we've tried it that way. And what happens is humans just think they're gods, and we worship them as gods or as angels or whatever. And then we end up screwing up again, and we revolt against them because we don't want to have angels or gods over us because we're humans, we want to be powerful ourselves. And so the right answer, to this whole planetary game is letting us go through our transformation, and facing our shadow and choosing to change. And, they can help us from destroying ourselves, and they'll stop us from bombing ourselves with nukes. But the phase of transformation is critical. And through this state of this blooming of realization that we're going through, we build our own starship technology. We build our own energy systems that run off of the quantum vacuum field. And as we build all of these ourselves, we know that we've done it ourselves. And so we come to the rest of the galactic community as equals. And this is really important because all star family have to meet each other in council as equals. No one's above any other.
No shortcuts. No
shortcuts.
Right.
So that's literally what we're in the middle of right now, is that process.
Apollo, an amazing conversation tonight, and I've literally got 15 seconds left. Out of all of your websites, which one should everybody start at first?
Well, if you go to adamapollo.com, it's got links to everything else. So just come find me there, and hope to see you guys in some of the amazing academies and some of the adventures. We're going to Mexico for an epic expedition in the Resonance Academy. Please check that out. Look up Mexico Expedition Resonance, as in Vibrational Resonance Academy. And I'm going there with a group of other brilliant thinkers and amazing people. We're going to a bunch of amazing sites, Teotihuacan, and some sites that nobody's had access to get into. We've been working hard to get into some really secret spots and debunk the old archaeology and reveal the fact that we're more connected than people think.
Thank you so much, Adam, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And I truly look forward to the next time that we have you on the show, and we'll go deeper into another subject. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Thank you, guys.
Great conversation, Adam Apollo. Start at adamapollo.com. All of his links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. What a great conversation tonight. Tomorrow night, right here, Reese Darby. Thursday night is another Fader night with open lines all night long. With that, we're going to wrap. Fade to Black's executive producers Rita Camurian. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vitoa, Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast is owned and copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Until tomorrow night, I want everybody to be safe. Go Beckley Tepe.